Hey guys, I'm Pastor Marion, and today I will be speaking about missing books of the Bible, but the one that I am narrowing on today is the book of Esther and the chapters that are missing from Esther. And to those who have not read the story of Esther, that's not good, but in 2 minutes I will give you a brief overview of the story of Esther. Now, there was this king who had a wife or a queen called Queen Vashti, and there was some event going on where the king drank too much and he was a little tipsy. And so he called Queen Vashti to come, but Queen Vashti said she wasn't coming. And so this was a great dishonor to the king. And in order for her to learn a lesson, and just so that they could set a good example that all the women would not be dishonoring their husbands like that, Queen Vashti lost her throne and the king was in search of a new queen. And a number of girls were groomed over a 12-month period, and Esther was the one that was chosen from those young girls to become queen. And Esther was a girl who was a Jew whose father had died, and her uncle was the one who raised her. So when Esther is now living at the king's palace, or wherever she was living close enough to the king, her uncle would come by that place every day. He would be at the gates, I believe, and as this man that was very close to the king, like the king had him in this top position, he was called Haman. People would bow down to Haman as he was passing, but Esther's uncle, whose name was Mordecai, he would not bow down to him. And Mordecai was very upset about this, and so what he did was to plot to kill all the Jews. And he got the king to sign it and seal it with his signet ring. And this thing was very upsetting to the Jews. And so Mordecai got word to his niece Esther, who was now queen. And Esther did what she could do to get it to the king. I won't go into that. And this was how eventually, because of the favor that she had in the sight of the king promised her to give her whatever her request was, up to half of his kingdom. But her request was for this person who was plotting to kill the Jews, to kill her people, to be dealt with. And so this led to the fall of Haman, that cruel man, and this led to the rise or the promotion of Mordecai, who took his place, who took that wicked man's place in the king's kingdom. So that's a nutshell of Esther and how she became queen and how her uncle got to that position. Now, Esther, let's get to the meat of the matter. Esther is the only book in the Bible that does not mention the word God, G-O-D. It's not mentioned anywhere in that whole 10 chapters. But I know that my God was all over that story, because it was God that gave them victory. It was God that worked it out. And I didn't tell you this part. There was a time when how Mordecai got that favor was that there was a time when he overheard some men plotting to overthrow the king, and he got word to Esther, his niece, and she told the king, and so those men were killed. And then one night when the king was going to bed, he couldn't sleep, and he got up and he took his book, because they recorded everything, and he looked in his book and he saw what Mordecai had done. And then he said, but we all know, I know, that was the Spirit of God that was stirring him up so he couldn't sleep. That was the Spirit of God ready to place Mordecai in a position where he would be promoted and no longer be the one that was looked down at, just hanging out by the gate every day, not having anything to do. So that was God there, even though they didn't mention God in the story. But why we're talking about the book of Esther today and the missing chapters is because it's so funny that we get to the end of chapter 10 and they made chapter 10 with 3 verses, and then in the Apocrypha, these are all the missing books that they say they cut out of the Bible for whatever reason. It starts or it continues from chapter 10. So we have chapter 10 in our regular Bible with 3 verses, and then the additions to Esther continues with chapter 10 from verse 4. Now here is where it gets truly interesting. Verse 4 of chapter 10, that is cut out of the Bible. It says, then Mardochai, that is Mordecai, they changed, the older versions had the original name, but they keep changing the names as they change the versions of the Bible. It says, then Mordecai said, God hath done these things. Because it ended in verse 3 of chapter 10 in your Bible that you have. It says, for Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. And now we get to verse 4. Then Mordecai said, God hath done these things. For I remember a dream which I saw concerning these matters, and nothing thereof hath failed. God had showed him everything that was going to happen. God had showed him his promotion that was going to come. God had showed him how Haman was going to go down. He saw it all already. A little fountain became a river, and there was light, and the sun, and much water. This river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen. And the 2 dragons are I and Haman. That was the man that was plotting against him. God showed it all to Mordecai in a dream before it happened. But when we read further, I'm not going to read further, but it goes all the way to verse 13, and you would be surprised how many verses had the mention of God. God was mentioned in verse 9, verse 10, verse 11, verse 12, and verse 13. But through the entire book of Esther, from chapter 1 to 10 and verse 3 of what you have, there is no God mentioned. And I looked at it and I said, no one can tell me. I'm not supposed to assume things, but this is way too obvious. But hear this now. When you read further, when you get to chapter 11 and 12, you're going to be reading. You can download the missing book. Look for the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha. And that will cover all the books that they say are missing. Some find 15, some have 16. It doesn't matter. I'm sure whichever one you get, it will have the additions to Esther in it. But when you read the additional chapters, you are going to see that one of them speaks about the prayer of Esther. This was the prayer that Esther prayed to God when she declared that fast for her people, among her people, for them to fast so that God would grant her favor in the sight of the king, and so that her people would not be killed. This prayer came from before. It didn't come at the end after chapter 10, because after chapter 10, the story ended at chapter 10. So these pieces, they cut out of the story in the middle of the story. it also showed where Mordecai prayed. And this prayer that it spoke of, the things that he was praying about, they too were before all that happened. I'm going to see how quickly I can find it. So the rest of chapter 10 and chapter 11, they speak about the dreams that Mordecai had, the things that God had showed him that were going to happen. And then in chapter 12, it gives more detail on the people that he heard that were plotting to take over, to kill the king. It gives more details on that. So you see too that chapter 12 belongs in the middle of the story, yet they cut them out. So 10, 11, and 12 so far belonged, a part of 10, the entire 11, the entire 12 belonged to a middle section of the story. Why were they cut out? And they all had some form of mention of God. Well, I know for 10, I haven't searched, 11 and 12 to see if God is in every one of them. So I have checked and I have seen where chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 all mention God. And it just makes me wonder, what type of people were those people who decided to cut out? Because it is very obvious with the book of Esther. I've read other things in other books, but this video is about Esther. It is very obvious that with this book of Esther, these chapters were cut out specifically to cut out God. There may have been other reasons, but this is the one that is very obvious to me. You don't cut out the middle of the story and then you get to the end of the story. And you cut the end of the story short. The rest of the story is not important. There is a part of it that speaks of how great Mordecai came. They don't think that that should be mentioned. I was watching someone recently, actually somebody shared something to me, and the person, this is why we have to be careful who we watch, who we listen to. This person was calling it, such a coincidence for the king to suddenly not be able to sleep, and so the king decided that he was going to do something. It's not a coincidence. That is how God works. When God is making his move, when the Spirit of the Lord has something to do, this is how he moves. You will be unsettled. You don't know what happened. Something woke you up. Something is stirring in your spirit. Something is telling you you've got to move. This was God. So they may have cut out God. But when you have the Spirit of God, and I pray that even those without the Spirit of God can take a closer look and see that God was right there. Woe be unto those who remove anything from his book, who add anything to his word, or remove anything. God's going to add plagues to them. That's what he said in his word. And some of us have to be careful how we critique the Bible because we were not there. We don't know some of the things that are true. We don't know some of the things that are not true. And not because we see different accounts of a story, it doesn't mean that the story is not true. It just means that by the time the news got around to different mouths, the one that was recording it probably didn't get the most accurate story. And this is why you will see different versions of the same thing. And I like to give, for example, when Saul told one of his men to kill him, but when another young man, when this man came running to David announcing that Saul was dead, and when David asked, he told David that he killed him. He saw Saul and he wasn't dead. And it doesn't matter whether it was Saul's servant, whether his killing didn't totally take him out, or if it was this guy. But David said, how dare you touch the Lord's anointed? and that was how that went. But we use these little inconsistencies to make it look as if the Bible cannot be trusted. The Bible, this is what we have. We cannot continue to blaspheme because we do some things without even knowing what we're doing. We cannot call the Bible fake. We cannot describe the Bible in that type of way. The Bible is not fake. They may change things and they may have added some things, but overall, God is speaking through his Bible, through his word. God has given me word for myself in a dream straight from the book of Esther. So God approves, God sanctions his word. And the thing in his word that is not true, that one thing that may be there that is not true, God's not going to use it to speak to you. So let us trust what we have as the Bible. But back to the subject, I want you to download the Apocrypha, get the missing books, and look into the book of Esther. Look into what I have just shared with you. And I want to know in the comments, what do you think? How do you feel about the fact that the prayers by Mordecai and Esther before the Jews, were saved from death, before all of that happened, why did they cut out the prayers and put them and say, oh, those books were lost? Why is it that there is no mention of God in the entire book of Esther, all the way to chapter 10, and they put 3 verses in chapter 10, and then in the missing books it continues from verse 4, and verse 4 has God? What were they doing? What do you think? Put it in the comments. I would like to hear your views. There are many more things that I've seen. There are some videos that I'm going to have coming up. I don't want them to be very long, but there are some videos coming up about some missing verses in some of these later versions of the Bible that you all love to read so much because they sound better, because the language is easier. It's not everything that is easier is really better. It's not everything that is easier is really the truth. I don't want to miss out. I don't want to be reading a Bible where some things are cut out when I have an older version of some things that are not cut out. And yes, we see tonight that even the older version has some things that are cut out. But for the most part, this is what we have. Let us use it and let us connect with the Spirit of God, and he will speak. God will speak. God is always speaking. This is God's written word. This is written word. But God himself is speaking every day. Amen. I thank you for watching. I hope you get what I'm saying. I hope you will be interested, something will be stirred in your spirit to go and dig deeper into this. It's not many chapters, but even after checking out the missing books of Esther, that you will want to dig into all those other ones. Because I heard someone say, this is the only Bible that has been approved and we shouldn't read the other. No. We need to read them. We need to see all the different variations of the stories out there. It doesn't mean that they're lies. It's just different accounts of the stories. If you ever read the book or the story, I don't want to call it because it's not called the same book in the missing ones, but if you ever read the entire story of Joseph and how detailed that story was, but it's extremely long. And for that one, I can see why, we have an abbreviated version, but it's good stuff. It's very interesting. I see some things to where I'm wondering, did they deliberately cut that out? I don't know. But I have a sneaky feeling about the missing books of Esther. God bless you. I'm Pastor Marion. Please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.